I definitely agree with you on comparing Al-Razi, especially with the young Hegelians, that idea that dogma and revealed religion is old wives' tales, founded on contradictions and ignorance and dogmatism. That very much sounds like that.
Welcome. This is Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Len Goodman's Chapter 33, Happiness, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
And then he's so dismissive of religion in any way. And Goodman points out he's not dismissive of God. He hopes that his soul will rejoin God when reason has freed it of its earthly trammels. And it's like, yeah. So he believes in this perfectly rational God that will somehow join once we become fully rational and just throw off the bonds of the earth. And that sounds very, it sounds very young Hegelian. The other, there's another group, and I don't know that this is widespread yet in thinking. In doing a little bit of reading in science fiction, there's been science fiction writers who've been writing about this concept. I forget the actual term, but when humanity will change and will become immortal, and because we'll be able to upload our minds to the cloud, to some sort of computer state, and we'll continue to exist, but we won't be in necessarily bodily form. We'll just be in this computer form. And there have been I've read a number of science fiction novels by a number of people that deal with that concept in different ways, and some who talk about that's just the way that people become immortal. Others talk about the people who live that way becoming the rulers of the universe, while there's still people in flesh and blood that still exist, and different ideas about that. But it reminded me of that as well, that there seems to almost be a sense in which, for these folks, it's maybe not joining God when we free ourselves from earthly trammels, but almost become like God, right? There is this sense, and that's maybe where there's even a tie to the new atheists, that the new atheists don't believe that there is a God, but they look forward to their pure rationality and this time that comes when we can all upload our rational thoughts to the cloud, this universal cloud of rational thinkers, and at that point we'll be free from all the bounds of the earth, and things will be just great, and we'll be like God. And my first thought is that just in the same way that God used the mixing up of languages at the Tower of Babel, I just picture God having his way with that cloud someday too, and man thinking that he's way above God, and turns out not so much. But maybe somebody ought to write that science fiction story.
Yeah, great point. There's another thinker in here that Professor Goodman talks about, and that is Farabi. And this one took some thought, in the sense that there were some very technical terms thrown around that it's probably not best to go deep into them for fear of falling off the edge and showing just how foreign of a world it is to me. But with respect to Farabi, there was some discussion of the concept of emanation, which we've talked about in detail earlier, this Aristotelian idea. That reality emanate, and that's how we have knowledge of it. The glass of water in your hand emanates itself to your senses. Now, related to that, Farabi talks about this thing that he calls the active intellect. What is that? The idea seems to be here that there is a divine link, there's a divine presence to some degree in all things in nature. And by being in that nature, and by having a mind and an imagination that is invested by this active intellect, Farabi seems to think that such a person is raised to a higher plane of living, intellectually and practically. And so, interestingly enough, it's probably best for me to contrast this with a Christian approach. And so the idea here is that it is through the study of the scriptures in Christianity, through the divine revelation in the Bible, that as one becomes more and more of a capable theologian, and I use that in a general or a broad sense, one becomes steeped in the wisdom that's in the scriptures. Now, here for Farabi, this contrasts, in his view, he's thinking about the rational faculty. The practical and the speculative part of reality will spread to his imagination. And so being an inspired man, in this sense, is to be a man who receives revelation about things through this active intellect. What am I trying to say? Whereas in the Christian sense, you study the scriptures to become wise, perhaps in Farabi's thinking, in the studying of the world, one becomes wise. And it's philosophy, not theology, that makes one this consummate thinker. And the highest rank of humanity and the supreme degree of happiness is related to the degree that he is able to be lifted or to lift himself with this active intellect. And so I thought that was a very interesting difference between Christianity and the thoughts here. How about you? Did you have anything particular about Farabi that stood out for you?
That was, by the way, that was really helpful. I think I saw a few things based on that I was seeing in this chapter a little better, just based on that short discussion. So thank you for that. I found a couple of things on this section about Farabi interesting. One is this discussion of virtues and how our natural inclinations may predispose us to certain particular vices or virtues, and people aren't necessarily born vicious or virtuous, but there are ways that we can become more virtuous, and there may even be good rulers, people who draw us towards that virtue, just as a doctor guides patients to be more healthy through some of the things that a person can do to exercise and medicines and things like that to get healthy, that he sees this role for a ruler of helping people become more virtuous. And it's interesting because I think there has been, maybe not, I haven't seen it as much recently, but there has been some discussion in the past, 20, 30 years about how do we develop virtue in our society and different ideas about developing virtue. Some of those ideas, especially from non-Christians, but even from some who I think would call themselves Christians, have been less engaged with we learn about virtue through revealed truth, and more about we learn about virtue either by going inside of ourselves and finding our true self, or we may find it from copying others or from telling stories. There was a movement, I think, probably 20 years ago, where the idea was you could teach children virtues by having them learn stories of virtuous people from the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans and things like that. We need to get back to the classics, but that back to the classics movement was often separated from going back to scriptures and to revealed truths. So I found that interesting, just that idea of how do we become virtuous, and this reliance on these virtuous kings that we need to follow. So that was rather interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Chuck. I think thinking about this, these thinkers that we've mentioned here specifically from this section, Professor Goodman loosely calls them members of an intellectualist tradition. And so this would be this idea of the rationality of the human animal. And mankind is never being so close to the divine as when he's thinking in this rational fashion. And so even at the time of these thinkers, there were responses to that. And so not everybody thought in this intellectualist tradition. So you had other thinkers who would challenge these ideas of the active intellect, challenge this idea of the primacy of philosophy. And so you would see, in addition to this rationalist or intellectual movements, you would see ideas in mysticism. So you would see mystics, and they would talk about other ways to find a path toward God, seeking a direct contact with God through another means as opposed to being the rational being. And so these mystics would advocate things such as asceticism, ecstatic experience, antinomian exercises. And that's just a coy way of talking about don't be so duty bound, don't be so focused on duty. Fail to find God if you become legalistic, might be a term that makes sense in our cultural space. And so we see that there were movements in Islam that countered the rationalism of these philosophers, things like Sufism, for example. And so there, it's just about experiencing God. Professor Goodman talks about this taste of divinity. And what an interesting set of contrasts. And my friend, I think we've had real profit from this section, though both you and I struggle with the strangeness of it to our own senses. These are largely foreign conceptions to us. Despite that, I thought the introduction was good, and I just wish we had someone on here who could do the material even more justice than I suspect that it deserves. Any final thoughts on this section regarding Islamic thought?
Yeah, the one thing that I found interesting at the very end of Goodman's discussion on the Islamic thinkers is that he ends and with this Jewish philosopher from the 14th century, Hasdai Crescus, who I'd never heard of before. And I think Goodman's reason for bringing him up here is as part of that movement against the strict rationalism, strict intellectualism that you describe. And yeah, that we see from things like Sufis. And I think some of the things that I've learned about the Muslim tradition move in that direction. These and some of these other who experience God less through rationality and more through experience. But I found in any case that might have been Goodman's reason for mentioning Crescus here. But I appreciate it, and it made me want to dig in a little bit and maybe learn a little bit more about Crescus. I haven't had time to do that. But he describes Crescus as responding to the intellectualist tradition by locating human fulfillment not in knowledge, but in the fear and love of God. Thus, fulfillment of God's commandments has intrinsic and not just instrumental value. Man is not the same of his mind, and the philosopher's coy promises of intellectual contact with the divine are deluded. Acquired intellect is an incoherent notion, and yet Crescus too pays tribute in a way to the intellectualism that he spurns, for the love of God and its counterpart in the fear of God were still meant as ways to bringing the transcendent into human. And I just found that, to me, there was a lot there that was meaningful. And there is a sense in which, and you and I have talked a little bit about this as well in some of our earlier discussions, especially of 19th century philosophy, that there is this, it seems like there's been this movement back and forth between sort of very rationalistic ways of thinking and then more irrationalistic ways of thinking. And this pendulum keeps moving, but without a concept of revealed truth and understanding who God is as he reveals himself to us, we always get stuck into one or the other of these, and both of them are flawed. And what I appreciated about this last Jewish philosopher, and even though he isn't coming from it from a specifically Christian view, it seemed to me that he had at least some understanding of that and some balance, in that he understood that we are not going to find fulfillment solely in rationalism, solely in just our own human thinking about things, that we actually must experience the fear of God and the love of God. And that's really what's going to fulfill us. But in doing that doesn't mean we just go off and become like the Sufis and spin around and chant and that's about all we do is just pursue this sort of mystical grabbing onto who God is. But that there still is a value to thinking about God, to doing some rational work, because the love of God and the fear of God are still ways of bringing that transcendent idea into our daily life. And that seems to be different than the Sufis, who there becomes almost a separation between daily life and then this pursuit of God that you see. And Crescus brings those two things together. So again, I don't know anything about Crescus, but it makes me want to read him a little bit more and find out a little bit about who he is and whether there might be more that we might be able to glean from this Jewish thinker. It was a good way to end, I thought.
Amen, my friend. Yeah, thank you. That really brought this section to life for me. You and I have both said is a challenge for us. Now, I do want to end this section on a bit of a joke, and it does involve a personal story here. Many years ago, I had a dear friend who I would talk with about these issues like you and I talk. And my friend was not a believer, but we loved to chew the fat, as it were. And my friend said to me in one of these discussion sessions, he said, "You know what your problem is?" Or put another way, do you know what's wrong with your belief? And Chuck, the joke here is that if you're ever asked that question, try getting out of hearing the answer. So if somebody says to you, Chuck, do you know what your problem is? The answer, no, I'd rather not know, is usually not one of the acceptable options. I knew he was going to tell me something that he thought I wasn't going to want to hear. And so he was considerate, and he played for me a song, and he said, listen to this song, and it's your problem is answered by this song. And I'll just quote a verse or two from this song. It's by Johnny Cash. It's called No Earthly Good. And here is the lyric. Come heed me, my brothers, come heed one and all. Don't brag about standing, or you'll surely fall. You're shining your light, and shine it you should, but you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. The gospel ain't gospel until it is spread, but how can you share it where you've got your head? There's hands that reach out for a hand if you would. So heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. And that was my friend's criticism there. And I think that's a classic criticism of what Professor Goodman calls this intellectualist tradition. And I wouldn't have put myself there, but I thought my friend offered me a very good critique. I took my medicine, as sometimes we must in these philosophical discussions, and we remained friends, which is always important when you're talking with people about these kinds of things. So thank you, Chuck. I thank you that you and I remain friends, even after talking about some of these really endlessly interesting different thinkers. And also thanks to Professor Goodman for providing us with such a chapter of great material. Any other final thoughts for today's session?
That was interesting. I've heard that saying. In fact, I've even heard pastors talk a little bit about that saying that it's possible to be so heavenly minded that earthly good. Although usually I think they're coming at it in a little bit different way than talking about intellectualism. But yeah, so I enjoyed that story, and I'm glad that you and your friend were able to continue those discussions even after he shared that song with you. That's a good anecdote.